This is something I'm going to say again and again and again. For reading comp, you have to spend a lot of time on the passages. And because we did that, we spent a good amount of time on the passages, really thoroughly understanding the passages. The questions should be really easy. And in fact, we really should not have to go back to the passage very much at all to answer the questions. So for reading comprehension, probably the first question will always be the main point question. They do want to make sure that you understand what the main point of a passage is. So that tends to be the first question. So the first one, question one says, what's the main point? All right, well, before you look at this, what do you think is the main point? So we said the first paragraph is just context. Second paragraph sort of also is kind of set up. Really, the idea is that this bias against being a specialist and not crossing between poetry and fiction is diminishing, right? This idea over here. And Rita sort of is the example of that we talk about to sort of try to persuade us that that's the case, that this bias is diminishing. So let's see. Rita Dove's work has been widely acclaimed. Sure, that can't be the main point. I'm sure she's widely acclaimed, but we're not trying to be persuaded that she's widely acclaimed. And primarily because, well, we don't know why she's widely acclaimed. Right? See, she's highly acclaimed for her poetry and fiction, but because of the lyrical elements she introduced in her fiction, I don't know. That even if this were factually accurate, it wouldn't be the main point. It would just be a factoid about Rita. She was born in whatever the year. Yeah, true statement, but not the main point of the passage. B says, Rita Dove's lyric narrative presents cluster of narrative detail, ordered cumulative experience without requiring blah, 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 whatever. Okay, fine. Maybe this is true. And in fact, I think this is a pretty decent summary of what we talked about in the last paragraph about her lyric narrative. But come on, that's not the main point. This is way too specific. C says, working against a bias that has long been dominant in the US, recent writers like Rita Dove have shown that lyrical use of language can effectively enhance narrative fiction. Oh, but that's not. So the emphasis, this part started out really good. Working against a bias has long been dominant in the US. The bias is against someone generalizing in both poetry, or rather doing both poetry and fiction. That's the bias. But the bias here, as the word later, as this answer choice goes on, we find out that what they mean by bias is that you can't use lyrical language to enhance your fiction. And then Rita is supposed to have shown that you can use lyrical language to enhance fiction. I mean, I'm sure Rita has done that. She, in fact, it's true in her fiction there are elements of lyricism of poetry which makes it better, but that's not the main point. You see, again, that's not the main point. The main point is the fact that people now write in both genres of fiction and poetry. So that's why D is not correct. It just doesn't capture the main point. D says, unlike many of her U.S. contemporary, Rita writes without relying on traditional techniques associated with poetry and fiction. That's not, she is unlike many of her contemporaries, sure, but not because of this. I'm pretty sure she uses techniques associated with poetry. I don't know what techniques there are associated with. What's a technique? Let's say we lay out words that rhyme together, and then that way we get a better sense. We can see it in front of us, and then we can just pick. I mean, why wouldn't she? If that's a technique that poets use, why wouldn't she use it? Or at least we don't know that she doesn't use it. Right? See, this is not the techniques of writing poetry and fiction. It's not really talked about in the passage, so we don't really know that she doesn't use the same techniques that other poets and fiction writers use. E says, Rita Dove's successful blending of poetry and fiction, yeah, she does that. It exemplifies the recent trend away from the rigid separation, of the two genres, that has been long prevalent in the U.S. That's right, and she is an example where, what do I say that? Several writers known for their one important example of this trend is Rita. See, recent trend, all this stuff is right here. Perfect. E is a very good answer choice. Question 2 asks, which one of the following is most analogous to the literary achievements that author attributes to Dove? So what literary achievement has Dove accomplished? Well, she was able to successfully blend poetry and fiction, two genres that traditionally are not blended. So that's what we're going to try to find an analogy to. So a chef, so Rita will be the chef, combines, what should it say? What should it say, right? If you want this to be right, what should it say? This is very, very helpful. Just like for logical reasoning, we do parallel method of reasoning questions. We do the same thing. You have to, as you read it, every little bit of information you have should feed it. You should feed that into your preemptive machine and try to preempt this answer choice. So if I'm talking about chef, then I'm thinking probably you should combine two cuisines. French cuisine with Brazilian cuisine or something, or Chinese cuisine with Oklahoman cuisine or something. So something that traditionally aren't combined. So a chef combines non-traditional cooking methods and traditional ingredients. Now we're talking about different things. One's a cooking method, the other's an ingredient. Both of these are at least on par as far as like what they are. They're genres of literature. These two are totally different. From desperate worlds cuisines to devise a new recipe. Yeah, that seems a little too non-analogous. This different world cuisine part is great, but this part sort of is not right. So we can play the game backwards too. If A were right, then Dove would have had to combine, say, non-traditional writing methods and traditional, say, subject matter from different world literature to devise a new, I don't even know, I can't finish this analogy. But anyway, so you can play this game backwards too, and it's really good practice. B says a professor of film studies becomes a film director and and succeeds what? See, like I wanted to say something like a film director has combined, I don't know, what genres don't go together? Romantic comedy and documentary. I don't even know. But anyway, whatever. So something like that. But like, what is this? Becomes a film director and succeeds partly due to wealth of theoretical knowledge of filming. Great. Well, good for you, professor, but that doesn't really match what we're looking for. C says an actor who is also a theatrical director, so it's actor, theatrical director, okay, teams up with a public health agent. Now there's like so many different things going on. I really don't like this already. Right? We need one person to combine two separate genres. So if we're going to be talking about acting, I want one director. Again, so it's the same thing. A film director, one director combines a romantic comedy and a documentary, something that's typically not combined, or whatever you may have. D says a choreographer defies convention. Excellent. Dove defied convention and choreographs dances that combine elements of both ballet and jazz. Perfect. Right. So that is exactly the ballet is say to poetry, jazz is say to fiction, and there is convention that you don't combine the two, and she defies that and combines the two exactly like Dove does. He says a rock musician records several songs from previous decades, but then introduces extended guitar solos into each. Okay, the rock musician had better be blending elements of rock music and say, I don't know, folk music, two things that aren't traditionally done. And the rock musician has to defy convention too, and then E would have a better shot of being the correct answer choice. Question 3 says, according to passage in the U.S., there is a widely held view. You see, so far what we've encountered is stuff that reads very similar to most strongly supported questions in logical reasoning. What we're being asked to do is take the information in the passage and try to support this. So this is, what do we know about the U.S.? Nothing except what the passage tells us. That's all we know about the U.S. So according to the passage, that's why this phrase is so important. According to the passage, you can't bring your own prejudices into this. So according to the passage, what do we know about the U.S.? There's a widely held view that what? Poetry should not involve characters or narratives. Yeah, isn't that right? Remember in the very first paragraph, we said there's a deep rift, the cause of which we're attributing to U.S. cultural views, but whatever, there is a deep rift that poetry is poetry, and what does poetry have? Elliptical and lyrical stuff, and fiction is fiction, which fiction has narrative and character. You see, so this seems like a really good answer choice. I'm tempted to choose it, but let's sort of consider the rest before we do that. B says, in the U.S., there's a widely held view that unlike writing poetry, writing a fiction is rarely and academically seriously. What? No, that's not right. That's in fact sort of inaccurate with this information. We have academic settings that train both writers of fiction and poets, so wrong. C says graduate writing programs focus on poetry to exclusion of fiction. That's also just very similar to B, wrong, right? We know graduate programs don't do that. Fiction is most aesthetically effective when it incorporates lyrical elements. I don't know when fiction is most aesthetically effective. I know Rita Dove, in her fiction, incorporated lyrical elements, which was aesthetically effective. But is that a general formula for how to make your fiction the most aesthetically effective? To do that, you see, we just don't know. You can't support that from the passage. E says European literary cultures are suspicious of general. No, but that's not true. European, if we don't know very much about European literary cultures. All we know is that in Germany, at least, which is a European country, they are not suspicious of generalists. In fact, they think it makes sense to be a generalist. So A, I will confidently choose A then and move on to question 4. Question 4 is asking us to jump into the author's mind. They're saying the author's attitude toward the deep rift between poetry and fiction in the U.S. How would the author describe how will we describe the author's attitude? What is his attitude? Well, does he like it? Let's go with very general, right? Does he like it or does he not like that there's a deep rift? He doesn't like it. That's why he spends a whole paragraph talking about Rita Dove and how she's the example of what's going to happen moving forward. More and more of these people blending poetry and fiction. So he, at the very least, doesn't like it. So that's a good sense of how we can anticipate the answer choice. Right, so let's just take that and see if we can read the answer choices and see pick out the right one. A says the author has perplexity, is perplexed as to what could have led to the development of rift. No, but that's not true. He offers a hypothesis for how the rift occurred. U.S. cultural attitudes, suspicion towards generalists. So I don't think he would be perplexed. B says he's astonished that academics have overlooked the existence of rift. Is that even true? Have academics overlooked the existence of rift? I'm questioning. I don't even know if he thinks that. I think it's very well possible that the author believes academics acknowledge the existence of rift. So I certainly don't think he's astonished. C says he's ambivalent toward the effect the rift has had on U.S. literature. I don't think he's ambivalent. I think it's unnecessarily constraining. I think that's his attitude about this rift. It's bad. It's not ambivalence. It's very clear. It's bad. Right? It's not unclear. It's clear. D says he's pessimistic regarding the possibility the rift can be overcome. Totally wrong. Totally opposite. In fact, I think he's optimistic about the possibility the rift can be overcome. That's why he talks about Rita Dove overcoming the rift. He's disapproval of attitudes and presuppositions underlying the rift. Yeah, there you go. It uses what we call referential phrasing, which is stuff that words that refer to other information presented elsewhere. And here, he's disapproving of attitudes and presuppositions underlying the rift. So what are the attitudes and presuppositions that underlie the rift? Well, we know from the second paragraph that it's this U.S. cultural suspicion of generalists. That's the attitude and presupposition that underlies the rift. And he is disapproving of being suspicious about generalists. Right? He used the rest of the passage to have Rita tell you why you shouldn't be suspicious of generalists, why it's good to be a generalist. So E is the right answer choice. 5 says, in the passage, the author conjectures that, what's his conjectures right here, his hypothesis, that a cause of the deep rift, right, the phenomenon, the explanation of the phenomenon, what's the causal story of the phenomenon between poetry and fiction, maybe that, we don't even need to look back, it's the U.S. cultural attitude. Poets and fiction writers each tend to see their craft as superior. No, we don't know that. The methods used in training graduates in poetry are different from those used in training. Yeah, sure, they are different. Right, the poetry methods probably are different from those others, but that doesn't explain this phenomenon. It's this hypothesis. Publishers often pressure writers concentrate on what they do best. We don't know that publishers exert. Publishers never mentioned in this whole passage. D says a suspicion of generalism deters writers from dividing their energies between the two genres. Exactly. A suspicion of generalism makes writers focus on just one of the two genres. E says fiction is more widely read in maybe, I don't know. I'm sure in our world it's probably true that fiction is more widely read, but that's got nothing to do with answering this question. Question 6 is asking us to identify the purpose, why the author, in the context passage, why the author mentioned Dove's experience in Germany. They give you a line cite, 32, 36. Whenever that happens, whenever they give you a line cite, you have to go back to the line citation. So 32 to 36 will be from here to here. Right, so she also studied for some time in Germany where she observed poets write blah, 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 blah. Yeah, we already know this. So the question is purpose. Why? Why does the author put this here? See, now you have to take stock of the general paragraph overall. We were just introduced to Rita Dove, who is an example of someone who writes both poetry and fiction. And she's talking about why that's such an okay thing to do because, as she's growing up, she never realized it would be a danger of writing both. And look, she studied in Germany where it was totally normal to do that. So let's see which answer choice expresses the purpose of why the author introduced this. Was the author's purpose in talking about Germany to suggest that the habit of treating poetry as fiction and fiction as non-overlapping is characteristic of English-speaking societies but not others? No, because see, who else? England, they speak English. In Australia and Canada, they speak English. So we actually don't. You can't say that because we don't know. Maybe if it said American society, characteristic of American society, but not, it would be better, but it still would be wrong because but not of others. See, we only got the example of Germany, so but not at least in one other place. That's not the case. So if you replace it like that, that A might be better, but as it stands, it's too wrong. So it's the author's purpose to point to an experience that reinforced Dove's conviction. So this is her experience studying in Germany, that reinforced her conviction that poetry and And fiction, see, I really like the way they phrase it, reinforced conviction. She already, as a child, she knew that there was nothing wrong with writing poetry and fiction. So it is something that already existed in her, and this was just reinforcing that poetry and fiction should not be rigidly separated. This seems really good. But let's consider the rest. Was the author's purpose to indicate that Dove's strengths as a writer derive in large part from the international character of her background? But no, that's not. We don't even know if her strength as a writer derives in any part as because of her international character or academic background. We just know that she commented that, hey, in Germany, journalists are totally cool. I mean, that's going from that to saying that to saying something like, well, you must have gotten your expertise as a writer in Germany. That's such a stretch. D says the author's purpose is to present an illuminating biographical detail about Dove in an effort to enhance the human interest appeal of the passage. But that's not. I mean, this is something like, and she was born on a small farm and grew up with a single parent or something. That's like that human element there. This serves a very specific purpose, which is this, because it's on point. We're talking about generalists here. So B is looking to be the right answer. E says to indicate that what Dove believes to be the origin of her opposition. That can't be right. I mean, that's not even factually accurate. Dove, before she went to Germany, she already had this idea that poetry and fiction shouldn't be separated. So B is the right answer choice. Question 7 says it can be inferred from the passage that the author will most likely believe which one of the following. So we're being asked to get into the author's head, and from the information in the passage, what can we say about what the author would believe? This is a potentially very difficult question because the information here, the support for the right answer choice, could really come from anywhere in the passage. So this is where having a really good short-term memory is very, very helpful. So A says each of Dove's works can be classified as either primarily poetry or primarily fiction, even though it may contain elements both. This is great. This just feels like exactly what this is talking about, what this paragraph is talking about, right? Her poetry has elements of fiction, and her and where's this? Her fiction has elements of poetry. So yes, primarily classified as poetry or fiction, but has elements of both. Perfect. A says the aesthetic value of lyric narrative resides in its representation. I have no idea what makes lyric narrative what gives it aesthetic value. I don't even want to read on anymore because it's just a bunch of stuff I don't understand. The representation sequence of events rather than its ability to invoke. I don't know. I mean, see, this is combining. This is sort of getting you to mess around with. But what do we know about lyric? The lyric part is where you invoke inner states. What about the narrative? The narrative is where you represent sequence of events. So lyric narrative supposedly has both. But then they're saying the aesthetic value is attributable in the narrative part as opposed to the lyric part. So, all that useless analysis only leads me to think that this is just even, I'm even more confident that this is wrong, but they do stuff like this all the time with wrong answer choices. Just like take information from here, just mash it up in like random orders and force you to try to understand what this is saying. So having a nose, being able to smell the wrong answer choice is very important because you won't have time on the actual test to go through the analysis that we just did. On the test, you're just like, you read this, you're just like, it just feels wrong, and then you have to move on. C says, the way in which Dove blends genres in her writing is without precedent in U.S. That seems, as laudatory as this passage is of Rita's achievements, I think it's a little far to say that she has no precedent in this. We don't know if she has precedent in this. In fact, if anything, we know that she is part of a group of people who are doing this. D says narrative that uses lyrical language is generally aesthetically superior. No. To pure lyric poetry? We have no idea. There's no comparison of like what's superior aesthetically to what. E says writers who successfully cross the generic boundary between poetry and fiction, they often try their hands at dramas. What? Really? I don't know. I mean, is this true? Does Rita write drama? And even if she does, do other people who cross the line between poetry and fiction, do they write drama? So it's not answered in our passage. Question A says, if this passage had been asserted from a longer text, which one of the following predictions about the near future U.S. literature would most likely appear in that text? All right, so we read this, and then we're being asked to identify a prediction that makes sense to sort of append onto the, end of this passage. A says, the number of writers who write both poetry and fiction will probably continue to grow. Yeah, this seems great. They already said, like, there are signs that this crossing the boundaries, bias against that is diminishing. Here are a bunch of writers who are already doing it. Here's Rita. So it seems to make sense that the writer who do what Rita does will continue to grow. B says, because of increased interest in mixed genres, small market for pure lyrical poetry is shrinking. First of all, I don't even know that there is a small market for lyrical poetry, and I certainly don't know why it would shrink even further. I don't know, maybe this blending will make this market grow, right? Like, who knows? C says, narrative poetry will probably come to be regarded as subgenres. I also have no idea. Would fiction that incorporates some elements of poetry, would that be regarded as a subgenre of fiction? Who knows? D says there will be probably be a rise in specialization among writers in, but that seems the opposite. That seems like there will be a decrease in specialization among writers in university writing programs. E says writers who continue to work exclusively in poetry or fiction will lose their audience. Again, that's just not a good prediction. Why would we don't have any reason to believe that pure poets will lose their audience.